Hello ladies and gentlemen, Gapesta here. This is Heroic Tyrant Velhari, and this boss is moderately difficult, but the good news is the difficulty scales down the further into the fight you get. So you start off really in the most difficult aspects of the encounter, but as you get toward the end, it becomes easier and easier, in my opinion anyway. So the fight itself, the basic idea here is you're dealing with the boss, who will transfer through 3 different phases based on her health. And she'll also spawn 3 adds, 1 unique add per phase. These phases are generally identified by different abilities, but also the most important mechanic is an aura that is active on the entire raid. And these auras will have various negative effects on the raid. And as mentioned, really the first phase is the most difficult, second one's a little bit easier, the third one's even easier than that. So you'll find that things are challenging for the first aura and the first mechanics, and then just become simpler as you go on. So before we get into the phase-specific mechanics, we'll talk about the basic abilities. This is stuff that the boss will do throughout the entire fight, so you have to obviously get used to these. The first, and probably most dangerous of these, is Edict of Condemnation. This will cause a random raid member to be targeted, a ranged player, and this person will gain a debuff that essentially ticks 3 times once every couple seconds. When they first get it, they have a giant purple ring around them to indicate the radius of the first ticking effect. Every time it ticks, it deals damage to the player and splits it among anyone within the ring, and it will also shrink the ring size down. So you can see I'm just looping this over and over. It's targeting a balanced druid there in the top left, and after he first gets it applied, he quickly moves into position, and as it ticks down, hitting a number of people and splitting the damage, the ring shrinks smaller and smaller. Now there are a couple of ways you can deal with this, but because of the aura that's active in phase 1, which prevents movement, generally the best method is to only have the afflicted player with Edict of Condemnation move, while the rest of the raid can stay stationary. Therefore, the best strategy we found is to move the Edict player into melee range once they get it. Depending on your raid composition, therefore how heavy your melee count is and with your tanks, you may or may not need to have other people that are not technically melee players move into position to help soak this. It's not a super frequent ability, so you can't afford to do so, but you'll have to adjust your strategy accordingly. Other than that, it's pretty self-explanatory. Once it starts, you have plenty of time to get into range of the majority of the melee group before the first tick goes off, and once you're in range, you just stay there for the next subsequent 2 ticks as the ring shrinks down, and all melee should pretty much help with it. Even tanks, you see there, you can slightly step into it if you are not quite in the range of it. So that is pretty much how you deal with it the entire fight, and it will slightly change as you progress through the phases, but overall that is the basics of Edict. The next basic ability is Touch of Harm, which is an absorb that targets a random raid member, and it absorbs healing on them. This is about 1 million on non-heroic, normal rather, and about a 1.3, 1.4 million on heroic. There's nothing special to do here. It's just a heal absorb, so make sure healers focus healing on that player. This ability is dispellable, however, but if you dispel it, it doesn't do anything other than jump to a new target. It will retain the existing heal absorb that was active on the previous target as it passes along with a new person. So if you need to, you can dispel it to actually heal up a particular player that it's on if they're dangerously low for some reason. So that's sometimes a good idea if you're in a situation where the raid's about to take a huge amount of burst and a player just happens, the only person that happens to be low health is the one that's afflicted by Touch of Harm. You can dispel it, swap it to someone that's full health, and heal up that person before the big hit comes in. The final basic mechanic is Seal of Decay, which is the primary tank swap mechanic. The boss will just stack up Seal on the current tank, and each stack reduces the healing that the tank receives by 10% per stack. So obviously if you get to 100%, you don't get any heals. Swapping this is very simple. you just basically taunt when your stack drops. This generally will be around 2 to 3 stacks per tank. So you can ideally swap it every 2 stacks, but for the most part, you just do it when your stack drops and you'll be fine. So the first actual phase that we'll get into is the Oppression Phase. This lasts until the boss hits 70% health, at which point she will immediately change her aura, therefore changing the current active phase. This first phase is marked by the aura of Oppression, which is active. And this aura will deal damage to any raid member every time they move at all. So the basic rule of thumb, of course, is try to limit your movement in this first phase as much as possible. Just like all of the phases and all of the auras in this fight, the strength of these auras increases. They become more potent the longer the phase lasts. So early on when you move a step, you'll take a minor amount of damage. But when the boss gets down to 72% health, for example, you're going to take a lot of damage when you move that same distance. So still, every situation in this first phase, the same rule applies. Try to limit your movement as much as possible. But just be prepared that the ticks from moving a certain distance will ramp up as the phase progresses. So you'll notice early on that Velhari has a power bar. This stores her corrupt power, of which she can have 3 maximum. So for each of the 3 different phases, she has 1 primary generator ability, and every time she casts this generator, she will gain 1 corrupt power. When she reaches the maximum of 3 power, she will then use her spender ability, which is her sort of big, scary attack for that phase, draining all her corrupt power, and she'll repeat the process. So she uses 3 generators in a row, and then a spender to spend it all, then 3 generators, then a spender, and just keeps doing this process over and over. So in the first phase, her generator is Annihilating Strike. She will target a random ranged player and indicate their direction with a red arrow coming from her. After the cast completes, she will slam the ground and hit a cone from her direction toward the targeted player, and of course anyone in that cone as well. This target will take pretty heavy fire damage. They will also spawn a searing blaze, which is a tiny little fire circle at their location that after 2 seconds it will detonate and hit anyone that's still in it, doing some damage and knocking them in the air. And of course, when Aura of Oppression is active, if you get knocked in the air, you will take some damage as if you moved side to side. Same principle. So the best defense against this ability that you can have against the Annihilating Strike, because it's a cone attack, is spreading out around the room and around the boss. So if you imagine no player being in front of one another, every player being side to side to each other, if at all possible, this will pretty much ensure that only the actual target of Annihilating Strike, the player being targeted with it, is going to be in danger of getting hit by it. Now it is a cone, so it will still hit people from side to side depending on the distance. But your best defense is just spreading around the boss so that no one is in front or behind you, and only people are to your sides. So worst case scenario with that sort of setup is only a handful of people get hit by it. So there you could see, you kind of could see, it was hard to tell, but there were quite a few people sort of in a straight line. So that strike hit 4 people because they were kind of in front of one another, which is not ideal. You want to be side to side. And we don't do a great job of it here. It's just sort of a technique that we've been trying to practice after this first kill. So try to make use of the space in the room by having people be spread out side to side with one another rather than front to back. And that will reduce the damage that you take from this. Other than that, the key thing to remember is the actual targeted player cannot dodge it. If they move, she will just follow them and hit them whenever she finishes the cast. So if you're targeted with an Annihilating Strike, just stand still, and other people can maybe move side to side to avoid it. It depends, how much movement is required and how late in the phase you are, and therefore how much damage you're going to take from the movement from the aura that's active. And then, of course, once it goes off and the Syrian Blaze circle spawns under people, you do have to move out from that, because getting hit by that is definitely more than the single tick of aura damage you would take if you move. So finally we have Infernal Tempest, which is the boss's spender. Again, she will cast this every time she gains 3 corrupt power. This ability is by far the most dangerous of the phase and probably even the most difficult of the entire fight. A lot of your early challenges will come down to having everyone in the raid recognize how this ability will affect their own personal movement and positioning, because screwing this up is going to cause deaths and maybe even wipes. So the way this ability works is it has a short cast time, and once it begins casting, it's a 4.5 second channel from the boss. During this 4.5 second channel, this ability ticks 4 times in total, once every 1.5 seconds. Every time it ticks, it causes 2 effects to occur at every single raid member's location. The first effect is it will do a small amount of fire damage to the player and anyone within 2 yards, very short radius. This small amount of damage to the individual player is not significant, but it's also not avoidable. However, because it's also going to hit anyone within 2 yards, this can be very dangerous for players that are stacked on one another, essentially melee. So it's really critical that your melee team spreads out from one another, and as they're moving to avoid this ability, they don't move on top of each other. They move generally outward, away from the boss, or on a just designated path that allows them to avoid each other. You can technically stack the entire melee team on top of one another and have them all move simultaneously, but the problem is the Tempest ticks would hit everyone there and just kill everyone. So because of that, they have to be spread, and they have to be moving in such a way that they don't overlap. Anyway, so that's the first half of the effect. Everyone in the raid, each tick, will deal around 30,000 or so fire damage to themselves and anyone within 2 yards. They will also cause a Searing Blaze pool to spawn at their location for every tick. So you can see as it's looping, these pools are spawning under every raid member, and because they spawn once each tick, you will get 4 pools under you throughout the channeling of the 4.5 seconds. Now, because the aura of oppression in this phase really tries to hinder you from moving too much, you cannot afford to just run the entire 4.5 second duration just to make sure you don't get touched by pools. So instead, the best technique is essentially to stand still when the Tempest begins and wait for 2 ticks to occur. So wait for essentially the 3-second mark on the channel, because the first tick happens instantly at the start of the ability. And once the second tick has gone off, that means you have 2 pools under your current location. You sidestep or move slightly, and after moving, you will then get the last 2 ticks at your new location. So 2 more pools will spawn at your second spot, and after that, those 2 spawn, the ability is over, you move back 1 more time to your original location, or just again, and that's it. So this is the best way you can absolutely minimize your overall movement to reduce the aura of oppression damage, while still avoiding all the actual Searing Blaze explosions, because you don't want to stand in the pools when they come out. So start in point A, wait for 2 ticks, 2 pools to appear, move to point B, wait for 2 more ticks, the final 2 ticks to appear, move back to point A. That's it. Now, once everyone in the raid has gotten used to this movement and can do it without getting hit by the actual explosions, there's still a pretty hefty amount of damage that's coming from this ability, which you just can't avoid. And the other thing is that sometimes this will overlap with Edict of Condemnation, which is extremely deadly. This will typically only occur once in this phase, depending on your DPS, but you should absolutely prepare for that overlap, because the timing does not change, so you're always going to get it. And when that occurs, make sure you utilize heavy cooldowns so that nobody dies. This is also kind of late into the phase, so it's particularly dangerous when that happens. So finally, the Ancient Enforcer is the Phase 1 add that spawns at 90% health on the boss. When it pops, it does a knockback to the entire raid, so this does a little bit of tick damage from the Aura of Oppression since everyone's moving, but it needs to be immediately picked up and tanked and faced away from the raid. The reason for this is its only real ability in this fight is Enforcer's Onslaught. After the cast time completes, it will hit the ground and create 2 fire orbs in whatever direction it's facing, so essentially toward the tank that's tanking it. These orbs, if they touch anyone, will cause roaring flames, which does do damage to them, but more importantly, it spawns a searing blaze pool at their location. These searing blazes are just like the blaze pools from everything else, from Infernal Tempest and from the Annihilating Strike hits. So there you can see I just got hit by the orbs and didn't move out of the pool, and it knocked me in the air. So this is something to watch for tanks in particular. The key is that since the mob is faced away from the raid, no one else in the raid should have to worry about this other than the tank. And in fact, this footage is a little bit old. We modified our positioning slightly so that now we sort of use 2 tank positions in this first phase, so that only one tank ever has to worry about dodging the pool that's created from those orbs in this phase. So I'd recommend doing the same thing, having one tank facing one direction, the other tank facing 90 degrees, and so that the tank that's on the boss doesn't have to worry about dodging for the orbs coming out of the ad and vice versa. In terms of DPS, they don't need to focus on this ad in this first phase. Its survival really doesn't do a whole lot. It's only, as mentioned, something that the tanks manage. And since the tanks are going to be swapping the boss anyway due to the decay stacks, it doesn't really add that much danger. So you don't need to actually focus this. I would recommend continuing to focus on the boss during this phase. You can cleave on the ad, do dots and stuff on it, that's fine. But generally speaking, the earlier you finish this first phase, the easier the rest of the fight's going to be, because you don't want to go too long in this phase and have the aura of oppression get really high and whatnot. That said, once you enter the second phase, once the boss hits 70%, then you do want to immediately switch and finish off the Enforcer, because you cannot afford to have the Enforcer still active while the second ad in the second phase spawns. So make sure it's dead before that second ad pops up. But other than that, you don't have to actually focus on this ad. So, second phase. Once the boss hits 70%, you immediately switch into the Aura of Contempt phase. So you lose the Aura of Oppression, and now Aura of Contempt is active. This aura will reduce the total health that a player can be healed up to 80%. So they cannot go above 80% health at the start of the phase. And as time progresses in the phase, just like the other auras, this increases in power. So for this aura, about every 13 seconds or so, it increases in power by 5%. So after 13 seconds, maximum health pool is 75%, and then 70 after another 13, and so on. So obviously, toward the end of the phase, health pools are going to be extremely low, and things can be quite dangerous, particularly if you screw up something. But overall, even though it's scary, as mentioned, I think the first phase is still more deadly. So the generator ability for this phase is Tainted Shadows. This basically debuffs the current tank as well as a handful of random raid members. I think it seems to be about 5 people in total, but it might depend on your raid size. Anyway, what this does is it will tick 3 times over 6 seconds. Every time it ticks, it will deal about 60,000 shadow damage to the player, as well as cause a corrupted blast to go off. This corrupted blast essentially deals 60,000 additional damage to anyone within 5 yards of the player where it's triggering. So it's another one of those mechanics that screws over melee pretty heavy, but nothing much you can do about it if you have any sizable amount of melee. The basic idea here, though, is your tanks should try not to be stacked on one another. So again, this is old footage. We've since learned a better technique. So one tank's, one position, one tank's 90 degrees off from them. And that way, only the current tank is getting afflicted with these explosions. Other than that, the rest of the raid should generally be spread out when this is happening, so that those people that are afflicted with it are just hitting themselves, they're not hitting other people. So the boss's spender ability in this second phase is Font of Corruption. So again, when she gains 3 power, she will use this. This will debuff a handful of random raid members. It seems to be 4 or 5, so again, it might vary based on raid size, unknown. But the critical thing is this debuff lasts 40 seconds, And while it is active, every time she uses Tainted Shadows, regardless of who she's targeting with those Tainted Shadows debuffs, the explosion will also hit all players with Font of Corruption. However, the one critical difference here is that if you are afflicted with Font of Corruption, you are immune to the area of effect explosion caused by Tainted Shadows, which is the Corrupt and Blast ability. So you will take the Tainted Shadows damage, which is just the single target hit that's on you. But if you have Font of Corruption active, you will be immune to Corrupt and Blast, which is the area of effect. Because of this critical difference, when you have Font of Corruption being immune to the area of effect explosion, this means you can actually take advantage of this fact and increase your healing by keeping people with Font of Corruption stacked on one another. So to do this, we use a position, as you can see to the right there, the purple marker, in melee range. And this is the designated Font of Corruption position. So players with Font of Corruption run into that spot and hang out there while Font of Corruption is active. It's critical, however, that players are very cognizant of their Font of Corruption timer so that when it's about to expire, they quickly get out of range before it actually goes away. Because as soon as they don't have it, the next time Tainted Shadows ticks, they're going to take area of effect damage from everybody. Just a huge number of people only get one shot. So make sure people have weak ores or something to watch this critical timer and get out when it's about to expire. Now, you don't necessarily have to do this stacked position for this ability, but if you don't, you're going to have a really difficult time dealing with Edict of Condemnation because everyone's health pool is so much lower in this phase. You can't really rely on moving Edict into melee, particularly if you're not super heavy on melee DPS, and have all those people survive the explosions, because they're going to be taking damage themselves from Tainted Shadows, or even melee that are afflicted with Font of Corruption, and effectively, because of the lower health pool as well, those people are just going to die. You would have to have a crazy amount of heal cooldowns going on. So we found it was better and safer to have this stack point in the melee position for Font of Corruption, so that when people come in for that, they can, for the Edict, they can have it overlap with basically the entire raid and not really worry about the explosion damage being all that dangerous. It's still obviously a danger, but it's not so severe that it's going to one-shot a couple people. So finally, the ad for Phase 2 is the Ancient Harbinger, and this will spawn at 60% health, does its little area of effect raid thing when it spawns, but needs to be picked up, tanked, in melee range, just like all the other ads. Unlike the first ad in the first phase, this one needs to be focused down immediately once it's available. So as mentioned before, you need to make sure the first ad from the first phase is not up when this one pops out. This mob's ability is the Harbinger's Mending ability. This will have a short cast time, and if it completes successfully, it will heal the boss for a little bit initial, as well as has a ticking hot that's applied over 9 seconds. I assume this hot is purgeable, but I don't think we've ever actually let it go off, thankfully, so we didn't really test it. If it's not, though, it's a ridiculous amount of healing that happens, and either way, you can't let it go off. So you need to make sure you interrupt this every cast. The cast time on this, the cooldown on it, seems to be about 10 seconds or so, but every time a cast is interrupted, the cast speed of the Harbinger will increase by 10%. So it doesn't change its cooldown, but it will cast faster, making future interrupts more difficult. So this is all the more reason you need to kill it quickly, because eventually it will just be too fast to successfully interrupt. Otherwise, assign 2 teams of 2 melee. Can be 2 melee DPS, or a tank can be included, whatever. 1 primary person, then 1 backup, so that every cast has at least 2 people trying to interrupt it. And you can just alternate this back and forth, and that will ensure that you cover them all. Now finally, when the boss hits 40% health, you enter the final Malice phase. The Aura of Malice for this will essentially increase damage dealt for every raid member by 20%, but they also take 10% extra damage. And this effect, again, is amplified over time. So you'll deal more damage, but you'll also take more damage. So obviously this emphasizes that this is sort of the burn phase. This is when you really need to lay into the boss and kill her before she kills you. All that said, as mentioned at the start, I personally think this is the easiest phase by quite a big margin. And, you know, it's not really that complicated to actually deal with. So the boss's primary generator ability is Bulwark of the Tyrant. And when she casts this, she'll target the tank location, basically do some shadow damage to that player, as well as additional random people in the raid. But it's not area effect damage, just single target. And she'll also spawn a despoiled ground puddle at their location. So these are just sort of moderate-sized pools of crap that covers the ground. You can see them all around the room there at the back. These ground things just do damage every second that you're standing in them. So obviously don't stand in them. The best way to deal with this ability, that we've found anyway, that's I think pretty common, is to essentially stack the entire raid up in melee range and move as a group, so that you're maximizing your use of the space around the room, because the pools do not seem to go away. So this is sort of the soft enrage of the phase, in that you will eventually run out of space. But beyond that, it's pretty simple to do. Keep everyone stacked up. When she casts Bulwark of the Tyrant and some pools spawn, everyone rotates around the edge of the room. In this case, we're just going clockwise. And you wait in the next position just out of the pools till the next round that she does it, and you move again. So the spender ability for this phase is Gavel of the Tyrant. And again, this is mechanically quite simple. When she casts this, she will hit everyone in the raid for a bit of damage. Also give them a small dot over time that does damage every couple seconds. And it will knock everyone back about 10 yards or so. The management of this is just really just to watch your spacing and keep doing what you've been doing. Because the knockback is not very significant, if everyone is stacked in melee range, it doesn't really matter which side they're on. They will just get knocked away from the boss a little bit. They may go into a pool temporarily, but they just step out of it after taking a tick of damage or so, if that. Mechanically, it's pretty simple to deal with. If you want to super maximize your damage intake and not take any extra damage, when it is being cast, you can have everyone sidestep slightly 90 degrees so that their backs are to the outside wall, whichever wall you happen to be near, because the knockback will be, I believe, in the distance or in the direction away from the boss. It's possible that it's going to knock you backwards based on your own facing, but in that case, you could simply just rotate your character as well. I haven't tested that because it hasn't really mattered. But either way, if you really want to ensure that people don't get knocked into a pool that's behind you, you can just do that. Just step against the wall just as it's being cast, and you'll be fine. So, as mentioned, like these two abilities, they're both quite easy to deal with, and it makes this phase much easier than the rest of them for the most part. So finally, the add for phase 3, which spawns at 30% health on the boss, is the Ancient Sovereign. Again, this needs to be picked up and tanked in melee, just like you've been doing for all the other phases. This needs to die immediately, and it's critical in this case because it will use the Sovereign's Ward ability. This ability will shield the boss, reducing the damage that the boss takes by 90% for the duration. So, obviously, you can't let this go. This is a lot of damage reduction, and you're really trying to maximize your output. So, you have two options in terms of how to deal with this. One is to lust immediately when the phase begins, to push the boss to that 30% add spawn phase quickly, get the add popped out, and then use the rest of your lust on the add. The other option is to lust once the boss hits 30% and the add pops. And that will ensure that the add itself dies as fast as possible. Both are completely viable, but either way, the basic rule of thumb is use all your big burst cooldowns, your burn spells, all that stuff to get the add down quickly so that you can get back onto dealing normal damage to the boss and finish the fight. Alright, so let's wrap it up with some DPS tips. First of all, DPS priority in Phase 1 is the boss. You don't have to focus on the ad there. In Phase 2, though, and Phase 3, make sure you kill the ad first and quite quickly. Make sure you always run Edict of Condemnation into melee range when you get it. If you're ranged DPS, this will target you. Phase 1, reduce your personal movement as much as possible, and make sure you sidestep for every Annihilating Strike, unless it's targeting you, and every 2 ticks of Infernal Tempest, you want to sidestep to avoid the explosions. In Phase 2, stay spread, but make sure you run to the assigned melee position if you get Font of Corruption. And once it's about to expire, make sure you get out of that position quickly. For melee DPS, in Phase 2, interrupt the Ancient Harbinger's Mending spell every time it's cast. For Phase 3, you want to stack with the melee group and move around the outside of the room every time pools spawn. Use big burst cooldowns, DPS cooldowns, Bloodlust, all that good stuff in this last phase. And after you kill off the ads, you can burn the boss really quick. So for tank tips, make sure you do a tank swap between the boss and any active ad, about every 2 to 3 stacks of Seal of Decay, whenever your stacks drop, essentially. When you do have an ad active on you, make sure you face it away from the raid, ideally away from melee most particular, and this way they won't be threatened by any of the sort of frontal attacks that happen in Phase 1, basically. In addition to that, try not to stack up with your tank partner in Phases 1 or 2. You can do so in Phase 3 without any problem, but in the first 2 phases, you do want to try to be not stacked with your tank partner if possible. In Phase 1, make sure you sidestep every 2 ticks of Infernal Tempest so you don't get hit by the explosion. This also happens to occur when the orbs from the ad in Phase 1 hit you, so make sure you sidestep those as well. In Phase 2, interrupt the Harbinger's Mending spell. You can use a focus macro or anything like that, even if you're not targeting that mob, to help you interrupt with when it's in melee range. And then in Phase 3, tank the boss and the ad along the outside wall, and every time the boss uses Bulwark, it will spawn a set of puddles. Everyone will be stacked up though, so you just simply rotate to the next position around the edge and get out of the pools quickly. You just keep doing this until the fight ends. Pretty simple. And then finally, healer tips. Make sure you always run in with Edict of Condemnation, get into melee range. And for healers, make sure you use big raid cooldowns when Edict itself overlaps with some other raid-wide mechanic. The big ones are really Infernal Tempest in the first phase and Font of Corruption explosions in the second phase. So watch for those overlaps, particularly the Infernal in the first phase, and time your raid cooldowns appropriately so that people don't get destroyed, particularly melee that are soaking that. Also, spam heal the person with Touch of Harm throughout the fight. This will always be active pretty much. You can dispel it if you need to actually heal up the player it's on because they're going to get heal absorbs otherwise. But it will just jump to a new player. So if you need to desperately heal the player with Touch of Harm active, dispel it off them, do regular heals on that player that was afflicted, and then keep healing the new Touch of Harm player to get them up. In Phase 1, just like everyone else, reduce your personal movement and try to sidestep for Annihilating Strike unless it's targeting you, and also sidestep every 2 ticks of Infernal Tempest. For Phase 2, stay spread out, but run to the assigned melee position when you get Font of Corruption, and then make sure you get out when the font is about to expire. And then finally for Phase 3, with the rest of the raid, stack up in melee, and move around the outside room every time a pool spawns on you. So, believe it or not, that's everything for Tyrant Velhari. Like I said, overall, it's a moderately difficult encounter, but the difficulty becomes easier as you progress into the phases. Once you reach Phase 3, it shouldn't take you more than a couple attempts to actually get the boss down. Unless you forget to pull one of the trash packs, or you actually choose not to, and then pull them during the fight like you see here. So pro tip, clear everything outside the room so that that doesn't happen. Anyway, as always, good luck, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Words and stuff should go here so that I can convince you to subscribe, but I can't think of anything, so please do it. I love you a long time.